Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. So we're continuing this section about morality. Part 5 is morality and destiny. And this chapter is why we cherish our sexuality. So Trent does a really good job in this chapter explaining this issue. He writes how it's really true that a lot of people think, like when you think of the Catholic Church, you kind of have a negative view of like, oh, Catholics, they think sex is so bad and it's dirty and it's shameful. But in fact, this is quite opposite of what the church teaches. And people think that the Catholic Church is obsessed with sex, like in a bad way, like obsessed. But the thing is, the Catholic Church just responds to the culture around us. Like JP2, Theology of the Body, during that time, during the time now, is that sex is all around us. Just go outside, like look at magazines and billboards and like open up your phone and go on Snapchat and see all the stories and everything is just, we're constantly bombarded with sexual imagery, content everywhere we look. So it's kind of good to just take a step back and think of like, how does this all affect us and how should we respond to it? So the Catholic Church just talks about these things because it's interacting with the culture. Contrary to what some people think, the Catholic Church does not teach that sex is bad or dirty. Pope St. John Paul II even taught that men have a moral obligation to help their wives experience orgasms so that the sex between them can be a truly intimate union. A celibate old man in Rome. Yeah, what does he know about sex anyway? So in case you're unfamiliar with this great man, Pope St. John Paul II, check out his work, Theology of the Body, Love and Responsibility. So actually he spent several years counseling married couples as a parish priest before he became the Pope. So yeah, he actually knows his stuff. And then Trent goes on to write, when people ask me why the church teaches that sex outside of marriage is wrong, I don't say it's because sex is bad or makes someone impure. I say instead it's because lying is wrong and God wants us to practice sexual honesty. So that's pretty much the theme of this whole chapter, is honesty. That's what the teaching is. And it's actually interesting because he writes about philosopher Peter Singer, who, if you've been watching my videos for however long, I actually went and saw Peter Singer in New York with my friend Alex, who is here.
We're going to go see Mr. Peter Singer. What?
Talk about the role that philosophy plays and why philosophy is really important.
Right.
That was super interesting, even though I definitely don't agree with a lot of his views personally. So in his textbook, Practical Ethics, Singer says the morality of sex is no different than the morality of driving a car, since in both cases all that matters is being safe. And he even says the moral issues raised by driving a car are much more serious than those raised by safe sex. But Trent writes how almost everyone knows that sex is more important than driving, and that it isn't a mere recreational activity like going to the movies. So you'll hear this a lot in society of, oh, it's like driving a car, and that whole test drive the car before you buy it thing, which I've spoken about this before, but Devon Franklin had such an amazing response to that. I was watching an interview, him and Megan Good have this book called The Wait, and in one of his interviews, someone called into the show, and they were like, oh man, I don't think I can do it. He's like, what about, you have to test drive the vehicle before you buy it. And then Devon responded in such a beautiful way.
I believe in, you test drive the vehicle before you purchase it.
First of all, I think that it's really important to not view a woman as a vehicle, and to even contextualize her in that way. Because when we do that, we kind of lower her value, and at the same time, we lower our value. As a man, what I have learned is that when you have a foundation of love and trust, when then you get into sex and marriage, you actually have a safer environment to be able to explore and to learn each other. And what I also know is that as a man, here's the thing. I don't want a woman to like me or fall in love with me because of what I do in the bedroom. I want a woman to fall in love with me because of who I am, what I'm about, where I am going. But certainly don't believe, I think that's actually a false way to look at it, that you have to test drive a vehicle. And again, I don't like to reference a woman that way, but I can tell you when you get into marriage and you have that environment and you begin to explore sexually, it's a safer, wonderful, incredible environment where both of you can experiment and begin to learn each other in that way. And it adds a whole nother dimension to your life.
Trent Horn writes how, consider that one of the worst things you can do in a romantic relationship is to cheat or be sexually intimate with another person. Most people would feel betrayed if their partner even asked to have a meaningless fling with someone else. But why? The only explanation is that sex can never be objectively meaningless. Instead, it has a sacred, unchanging meaning that is expressed through the language of the body. Our body means something, like the things that we do. A handshake is like a greeting, nice to meet you. And a hug says, I'm here for you. He writes how it makes sense that an idea as powerful as the permanent, faithful, and total gift of self to another person could only be physically expressed through the most powerful way to unite two people, sexual intercourse. So a lot of people talk about sex as like, oh, it's just sex, it's nothing, it doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, okay, but someone cheats on you. You're in a relationship with someone and they cheat on you, they have sex with someone else. Is it still just sex? Or does it mean something? So it's like we kind of decide what we want things to mean. Like, a lot of people don't believe in objective truth, but they kind of believe that, like, you can just decide. You know, as I mentioned in my last video, how we kind of decide who's a person who's worthy of life or not based on certain criteria. And we kind of we dehumanize the human person to make our actions okay. I think we do the same across the board to make it okay what we do. We kind of justify and explain things away and dehumanize or devalue things in general. Because if it doesn't mean anything, then it's not a big deal, even though it really is. But it's just kind of coping mechanisms with us getting through life and being okay with our decisions, even if it's not the right thing to do. So then he goes on to write, there's a little section about pornography. So this is a whole other topic, which could be a whole other video. Matt Fradd actually has really great resources on this as well, so I'll link everything I mentioned, I'm going to link below. What the church believes about pornography is best summarized in a quote attributed to Pope St. John Paul II. Pornography is not wrong because it shows too much. It is wrong because it shows too little. Pornography reduces people to objects that are only meant to satisfy the desires of a consumer. It also trains the user's brain to be excited by sexual novelty and by power over other people's bodies. This attitude is disastrous in marriage, where joy comes from being a gift of self to one irreplaceable person. And then he goes on to write one flesh. The Bible says that when God created Adam and Eve, they were both naked and were not ashamed. Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. So that's how we were created to be. Like, sex is not created, our bodies are not created to be shameful and to be ashamed. But this has been so twisted, and I think there's a lot of truth into the whole purity culture is damaging argument. Like, so many times the way that sex has been talked about in Christian and Catholic circles is so damaging and so harmful, of like, oh, it's bad, and like sex is bad. Christopher West also speaks about this really beautifully, how he talks about theology of the body, and he mentioned how we're all raised on the diets. There's like the starvation diet, which is the typical, like, oh, it's bad, don't do it, you're starved. And then there's the fast food diet, which is like, oh yeah, just do whatever you want. And then the third option is the wedding feast, which is what our faith is all about. But it's not really presented to us often from a young age that way. And so a lot of us grow up with very tarnished views of sexuality and views of our bodies. Just a lot of negative outpouring when it shouldn't be that way. So he writes how God doesn't want us to be ashamed of either of the bodies he gave us, or the pleasure that comes from uniting those bodies with our spouse. God could have designed us to reproduce without sexual intercourse, but he specifically wanted husband and wife to become one flesh. So then he goes on to write about how, what I mentioned before is like lying with our bodies. Not every act of sex will result in a child, but each act does express through the body what the couple already expressed through their wedding vows, which is, I give my whole self to you and only you till death do us part. Cheating causes so many people to end a relationship, whether they intended to or not. They use their body to communicate the most sacred form of love and commitment to someone else. And then he even goes on to say that even if a couple consensually has sex outside of marriage, their bodies still speak a lie to each other. No matter how much an unmarried person may say, I'll love you forever, he or she is always free to walk away from the relationship. So it's really true that you're not married until you're married. Before you're married, before you've made that vow, that commitment, entered into that covenant with someone else, then it's not the same. I think a lot of people think that if you've been with someone for years, if you live with someone, if you move in together, you have a dog together, you're basically married. But at the end of the day, you're not married until you're married. And if you're with the wrong person, if it's been years, I really encourage people to, it takes a lot of, easier said than done, but really consider you don't have to spend the rest of your life if you're not happy, if you're not, it's not the right person for you. But some people think like, oh, I'm already with them, or, they're just comfortable. It's like you have more freedom to walk away, even before you're married. A divorce gets really messy. Breakups are messy too, but just something to think about. It's easier, you have more freedom to walk away. When you're married, it's different. So the freedom to easily walk away disappears after marriage, after you've publicly made that promise in front of the community, in front of your family, in front of your spouse, in front of God, if you believe in God or not. But either way, it's just a completely different level. So, after marriage, a couple's sexual union expresses the true reality of their lifelong, faithful bond to each other. And then 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." And then Trent writes how he never regretted waiting until he got married to have sex with his wife now. He writes about there was no fear of disease, no fear of unplanned pregnancies, no fear that she would leave her if he just couldn't meet her sexual needs. None of that. It's just total love and trust on a different level. A lot of people I notice in relationships have so many insecurities, and they're so like, oh, they might cheat on me, or oh, they're, in the back of their mind it's like I'm not good enough, or there's a lot of insecurities. And then he writes how in its place was simply the joy of knowing that not only were they allowed to freely give themselves to each other, but that is exactly what God wanted them to do now that they were husband and wife. He writes how God's plan for sex never included shame, disease, lies, heartbreak, abandoned children, or abortion. Human beings are the ones who brought these things into sex through sexual dishonesty. And so the reason why saving sex for marriage is a thing is actually for our own good and our own happiness. Like, when you think about it, we're not meant to live these lives of like fear and insecurity and not trusting, like, oh, this person might cheat on me, or like not knowing what's going to happen. But when you can actually have a more foundational trust, more stability, that's what we're made for. We're not made to be selfish, but we're made to be a gift of self. Matt Fradd spoke this. I don't know if he was quoting someone else or if this is from him, but he said something along the lines of how lust is your body taken for me. Love is my body given for you. He writes how God loves us and wants us to be happy by saving sexual intimacy for marriage. That way, our sexual intimacy won't be haunted with shame, but will be an occasion when we can honestly say to our beloved, I give my whole self to you and only you, as long as we both shall live. He ends the chapter with the question, what about homosexuality? He explains the important point that the church makes a distinction between someone's desires and someone's actions. So desires aren't something that we can control. Like, no one can control who they're attracted to. That's not something they can control. So he writes how that shouldn't be so central to our identity. Like, we're not defined by that. So no one's sinning just because they have a certain desire. Regardless of your desires, we're all made in God's image. But that being said, we can control how we act upon those desires. And I noticed a lot of people, I was actually listening to a podcast, and a girl who was talking about her experience being bisexual, or I think she was trying to figure out, she's like, I don't really know, I'm attracted to girls, but also I'm attracted to guys. She was very confused on what am I, and what does this mean? I thought I was straight, but maybe I'm not, and like, she kind of like experimented with women, and she's just like in this whole world of not knowing and just being confused. Like, people stress out so much of, oh, this is my identity, this is my label. And then if people don't have that identity, they think they don't know who they are, and they're lost. Trent Horn writes how it's not so central as a part of our identity as a lot of people make it out to be. So it's really not a big deal, but people just go crazy trying to like put all these labels on things and figure things out, and it's like, oh, well, I don't really know what I am, and I'm so lost and confused. And I'm like, you're not lost, you're not confused, you're exactly who God created you to be, exactly how you are. You shouldn't spend time stressing out or being ashamed or embarrassed or uncomfortable in your own skin. All of us are called to chastity, to purity, to holiness, regardless of who you're attracted to. Same across the board. So that's pretty much it for today's video. In case you missed any of the others, I'll link them below. And the next chapter will be chapter 23, Why We Defend Marriage.